Hey everybody, I'm Jeff. We started a shiny new series last Wednesday night. We're looking for about 7 weeks at the idols that people worship when you don't worship Jesus. And ultimately, what I'm trying to do over the next 7 Wednesdays is to show you if Jesus isn't first place in your life, one of these 7 things are, and I promise you, they're going to let you down along the way. So if this is your first Wednesday night with us, we do stuff a little bit different around here. It's okay. If you've been around here before, I said this is really the series in the coming year that you need to bring your friends to. Like, get them to come in your car, take them with you on Wednesday night, have them stick around for community groups, and then you all go out and grab something to eat afterwards and talk about this sermon series. Because here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say this today. I said it last Wednesday night. It's basically going to be the same thing that I say every single Wednesday during the course of this Chasing Idols series. The stuff that we're talking about, ultimately, it's going to let you down. It's going to disappoint you. It's not going to last, and it'll distract you from your faith. And if you're sitting there right now thinking, Jeff, that's exactly what you said last Wednesday. Yep. And I'm going to keep saying it. Because that's the way an idol works. An idol tries to get you to take your attention off of what's really makes a difference in your life and put it on something that doesn't make a difference in your life. Tonight's topic is about power. So let me tell you about the second inaugural address that Abraham Lincoln gave. This is March 4th, 1865. The inaugural address itself, he's just been reelected. It's been put off for a couple of weeks because of very severe rains in the D.C. area. And when they finally get to the point that they can deliver the second inaugural address, the crowds are standing in bitter cold and they're in water probably up to their ankles at this point. During the inaugural address, it's very short, it's pretty somber, and Lincoln points to the war has been going for 4 years now, and our country has been through a terrible time, and it's going to get rougher before it gets better, because now that the war is wrapping up, we have to learn how to live with each other as brothers again. When he makes this famous statement in his second inaugural address, with malice towards none, Lincoln lays out how we as a country become brothers and sisters again after fighting each other for 4 years. During this inaugural address, he quotes from 3 different places in the Bible, from the book of Psalms, from the Gospels, and from the book of James. At the inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln has a special guest, actually several special guests that are in the crowd. One of them is the world-famous actor, John Wilkes Booth, who will within a month become Abraham Lincoln's murderer. I've got a picture for you of the second inaugural address. John Wilkes Booth is just a few feet away from him, and almost all of the men that will take part in the assassination attempt are right there at the second inaugural address with Abraham Lincoln when he's sworn into office on his second term. Now, all of that is to lead up to this statement. No one knows for sure if Abraham Lincoln actually made this statement, but it's credited to him. And honestly, Lincoln, maybe more than anybody else, could back up a statement like this. He said, if you really want to test a man, nearly all men can face adversity. And Abraham Lincoln, if anybody dealt with adversity, it was a man like Abraham Lincoln, his entire life, not just his presidency. Lincoln said nearly all men could face adversity. But if you really want to test a man's character, give him power. And Lincoln implied that power will usually destroy a man or show you exactly what he's made out of. And here's the thing. I've said this last week. I'll say it this week. I'll say it in the future. Power itself is not inherently evil, not inherently good. But power reveals what's already in place in a person's character, a man or a woman's character. And so tonight we're going to take a look at power and how it becomes a god for most people. In fact, I'm going to make this statement right up front, and you're not going to believe me, and I'm going to prove it before this night's over with. Every one of us in this room, I do, and every one of you, lust for power. Every one of us struggle with this idol. from time to time. And if you're sitting there thinking, I don't, Jeff, yes, you do, and I'll show you. First thing I want you to see about power, and I'm referring to our power here tonight. The word our I'm using to describe us, mere humans. Our power touches the divine. So if you're following along in the mobile app, we've got several different places from the Bible that we're going to take a look at in just a second. What do you mean it touches the divine? Well, first, let's go back and define what we mean by power for just a second. The idea of power is the idea that I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, to whomever I want, and no one can stop me. That's raw power. Now, you understand that that world doesn't exist, right? No one has that kind of power, but it's the kind of power that we're talking about tonight. When God has given human beings a little bit of power, He's giving us just a little bit of Himself. He's put His nature into human beings, and we have power that no other animal in the created kingdom has. By doing this, we sometimes will take what the Creator has given us and we'll distort it and try to make something more out of it than He ever intended it to be. And by doing that, we've turned it into an idol. And all of us will have this from time to time, this lust for power, this wanting more and grasping more and more and more power. So listen to what real power looks like and how God has given just a small glimpse of it to us. Okay, Psalm chapter 8, starting in verse 3. When I look at the night sky and I see the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you set in place, what are mere mortals that you should think about them? Human beings that you should care for them. You want to know what real power is? It's the ability to, with your will, create the sun and the moon and the stars and hang them in place. That's real raw power. And compared to us, that is light years away from the kind of power that human beings have. But listen to verse 5. Yet you made us, humans, you made them a little bit lower than God. And you crowned them with glory and honor. You gave them charge over everything you made, putting all things under their authority or all things under their power. If you think about all of the created animal kingdom for just a second, humans are different than all of the animals. Because we're the only part of creation that has the power, the authority to control, to some degree, the environment around us. We can't stop natural disasters from happening, but we have the ability to shape the environment that we live in. We have the ability at least to control ourselves and our own animal urges or animal instincts. For example, you cannot stop a dog from scratching fleas. Doesn't matter how hard you try. A dog will always scratch fleas. The only way to stop a dog from scratching fleas is to get rid of the fleas. You and I have the ability to restrain ourselves and to use some of the authority that God has given us for good. So when we take some of our authority, some of our power, and we place it under self-control, you're never more like Jesus. Because think about this for just a second. The one man who walked on planet Earth with all power and all authority gave his power up and willingly submitted himself to the cross, who could have stayed on the cross forever, but willingly gave his life up for sinners like you and me. There was a political party that came close to absolute power. It's Nazi Germany in the late 1930s and early 1940s. No one could stop the Nazi Party from doing whatever they wanted to whomever they wanted. A famous member of the Nazi Party saw the destruction. And by the way, the Nazi Party made the decision, if you're not like us, if you don't reach the level of humanity of the master race, the Aryan race, then you're less human and we're going to destroy you. And so they started with German citizens and systematically started to annihilate people that didn't live up to their standard of humanity. Well, one member of the Nazi Party, Oskar Schindler, used his enormous wealth and his great power for good rather than for evil. Oskar Schindler owned this enamel works factory. And with his own personal wealth and with the help of this factory, he bucked his own political party, the Nazi Party, and he personally saved the lives of 1,200 Jews. If you've ever seen the movie Schindler's List, there's a great quote from the movie Schindler's List. This is Liam Neeson and Ralph Fiennes in the movie Schindler's List. Y'all watch this clip. Because he's identified the real, here's what I called it, the paradox of power. You see, real power, raw, unadulterated power, is not being able to do whatever you want to whomever you want, whenever you want, and no one can stop you. Real power is when you do what you should do, not what you want to do. Real power is when you do what you know you must do, even when you really don't want to do it, but you know it's the right thing to do. That's real, raw power. And most of us, if we're honest, we often don't have the kind of power to do what we know we should do, even when we don't want to do it, the kind of power that Oskar Schindler just described. That's what separates us from the animal kingdom. That's what gives us just a little taste, a tiny little touch of the divine that God has put inside of us. And we're never more like Jesus than when we put our power under his authority and we do what we should do rather than what we want to do. André Gide was a French author who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And André Gide once said, as God's responsibility decreases in your life, your responsibility increases. I wonder which of the two is better qualified to call the shots in your life. You see, our power just barely touches the divine. But here's what I want you to see next. Power doesn't last. Our power that we wield here on earth, us meager human beings, that stuff doesn't last. Here's the point that I'm shooting at in this sermon tonight. I'm hoping by the time that this sermon's over with, you say to yourself, I'm not in control of my life anymore, and that's perfectly fine with me because I'm not the best person to call the shots in my life. Jesus is. You see, ultimately, our power doesn't last. There's a great example of this. It comes from the Bible, Deuteronomy chapter 8. Now, let me give you just a little bit of background before we read this passage. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, the children of Israel have been led for 40 years through the desert by Moses. Moses has got them at the edge of the promised land. They're just about to inherit the land that for 400 years God has been promising the Jews. And Moses is recounting for the Jewish people all that God has done for them. And Moses says, you remember how terrible it was in the desert, right? Like, you will never forget how miserable the last 40 years were, right? Moses is saying, those last 40 years, that wasn't the real test. In fact, that's junior varsity stuff. Let me tell you the real test. The real test is when you cross over into the promised land. The real test is when you start to live in houses that you didn't build. The real test is when you start to eat the crops that you didn't plant. The real test is when you're fat and happy and life is good. Can you still remember to give God control of your life then? Listen to how he words it. Moses words this in Deuteronomy chapter 8. He's speaking to the people of Israel and he says, he, meaning God, he did all of this so that you would never say to yourself, I've achieved this wealth with my own energy and my own strength. Moses would say, the money that's in your bank account, what's in your pocketbook right now or in your wallet, that's not your money. It's God's money. God gave you the ability to make that money in the first place. Verse 18, remember the Lord your God. He is the one who gives you power to be successful in order to fulfill the covenant he confirmed to your ancestors with an oath. Look, it's not the warrior on the battlefield. It's not the woman who's going through a divorce. It's not when you just lost your mama that you forget to lean on Jesus. It's when life gets good that we often forget to lean on Jesus. It's when life gets really good and everything is going great that we decide we don't really need Jesus anymore, right? Because I've got it made in the shade. And I'm afraid this is the condition of our society today. Like sometimes I don't wish this, I don't pray this for our country, but I sometimes think to myself, maybe another Great Depression would be good for our country. Because maybe it would drive us to our knees and cause us to say, we are weak and we need Jesus. If there was ever a guy in the Bible who failed to learn this lesson, It's Samson. Samson was a guy who had everything in front of him. God gave him immense, incredible power, and he squandered it all away, and he destroyed not just his own life, but the lives of many people around him because of his abuse of power. 2 weeks ago on Tuesday mornings, I started teaching a study. I want every guy in this room to listen for just a second. If you can make it, if you're not already at work, Tuesday mornings at 6 a.m. in this room, I'm teaching a study called the Samson Syndrome. If you're a guy who has sons or grandchildren, you need to bring them with you. Because the truth is, every man on planet Earth has the potential to make the exact same mistakes with their life that Samson made with his life when he got a little bit of power, when things started to get good. You see, our power is very temporary. It doesn't last. But Jesus' power lasts forever. Listen to what the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said about this. He said, when the tyrant dies, you know, the world dictator, when the tyrant dies, his rule, his reign on earth is over with. But when the martyr dies, the one who's been walking faithfully with Jesus and it's cost him everything, when he dies, that rule, that reign just begins and it never ends. It goes on forever. Which leads me to the next point. Our power is deceiving. Power lies to you. You never get what it says it's going to give you, and it will let you down every time. Listen, since Satan first tempted Adam and Eve in the garden with power, he's been tempting people with it ever since, and we've been believing the lie that power gives you. And the lie is that you can become good enough, you can become strong enough, that you don't need somebody else to call the shots in your life. You call the shots in your life. That world doesn't exist. God didn't create the world that we live in so that nobody else can tell you what to do. All of us have this in our DNA to rebel against authority. We don't want anybody telling us what to do. But that world is a fantasy. It doesn't exist. I'll show you in the Bible. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. So anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and they will be punished. Eventually, the lie that power tells you is that you can become more powerful than you really are, to the point that you can get away with or do whatever you want. Here's what I want to tell Kanye West about his song, Power. Real power doesn't come from Mongolian furs and big shiny diamonds. No, Kanye, maybe you should listen to what Lecrae says. Real power is when you can stare death in the eyes and not be afraid what happens to you next. That's real power. The power that we wield here, that stuff doesn't last. Now, I said at the beginning that all of us in this room lust for power, and you're saying, no, I don't. And I'm telling you, yes, you do. Because every one of us in this room have this inherent desire to be able to want to control the circumstances of our life, to want to be able to orchestrate the events of our lives so that we can call the shots and so that we decide what happens to us, not other people or the circumstances deciding what happens to us. All of us want to have enough power that we don't have to worry about circumstances, that nobody else has any kind of control over us. All of us are guilty of this, but all of us, according to scriptures, need somebody in positions of authority. Everyone needs somebody to have a person of authority over you. It's good for all of us, even me as the pastor of this church. When the pastors of our church meet together, when they all speak together with one voice, when the men that serve on the Council of Five, when they all speak to me with one voice, when our pastor emeritus, Dr. Don Wilhite, speaks with one voice, when all of those things speak together with one voice, I'm going to do what they say to do, because I view this as a voice coming from the Lord. This is the Lord's direction for our church. I'm going to do it even if I don't want to do it, because I need someone in authority over me, someone to help keep me accountable, and so do you. I don't control the circumstances of my life, neither do you. So I want you to commit this to memory. In fact, I want you to, if you got your phone out, I want you to write this down, and I want you to hang on to this. Or tweet this out today, because it's that important. As your power grows in your life, so will your restlessness, so will your difficulties in life. Let me put it this way. You are most at peace in your life when Jesus is most in control. And the more that you're in control of your life, the less he's able to control. And the less he's able to control, the more frustrated, the more angry, and the less peace you're going to find in your life. You see, the more Jesus is in control, the more peace you're going to have. The less Jesus is in control of your life, the less peace you're going to have. And all of our feeble attempts to grasp power. Look, even if you could do it, even if you could get enough power to control the circumstances right now, that stuff doesn't last. That's why nobody ever gets enough power. Everyone, even those most powerful men and women in the world, they all want more. Because they want to be able to control a little bit more of their circumstances. And in the process, they start to play the role of God, which leads me naturally to the very last point. The entire sermon is building towards this for us tonight. Our power is dangerous, very dangerous. There's this great story in Genesis chapter 11. I'm going to read it for you in just a second. It's a little bit of a long passage, but I want you to pay close attention for just a second, and I want you to try to see the danger of people trying to become powerful enough to control their own circumstances. Listen to Genesis chapter 11, starting in verse 1. At one time, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words. And the people migrated to the east. They found a plain in the land of Babylonia and settled there. They began to say to each other, "Let's make bricks and harden them with fire." And then they said, "Come, let us build a great city for ourselves with a tower that reaches into the sky, or a tower that reaches to heaven. This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world." But the Lord God came down to look at the city and the tower the people were building. "Look," he said, "the people are united and they all speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse the people with different languages. Then they won't be able to understand each other." And in that way, the Lord scattered them all over the world, and they stopped building the city. That's why the city is called Babel, because that's where the Lord confused the people with different languages. In this way, he scattered them all over the world. Did you see the danger our power holds? When we start grasping at power and wanting more and more power, when we start wanting to control the circumstances of our life, and all of us want to control our circumstances, what you're starting to do is you're starting to play the role of God in your life. You're starting to create an environment where you no longer need a God in your life. And the moment that you've created that environment, you have become God instead of him in your life. All night long tonight, I've been using the word our, O-U-R, to describe power. But I haven't told you the whole story. You see, there is an example of power in Scripture that is not limited, that is not dangerous, that does last forever, that doesn't disappoint. And of course, this is Jesus' power. And as Jesus is more powerful in your life, you will find more peace. As you try to become more powerful in your life, you will find less and less peace. That's why this passage in Genesis 11 is both heartbreaking and hilarious at the same time. The people actually thought they could become powerful enough that they could build a tower to heaven and create the circumstances where you don't need God anymore. And there are billions, listen to me, billions of people in the world right now who are building their little tower to heaven, trying to create the circumstances where I don't need God anymore, so that I can call the shots in my life. And by doing that, I become God instead of him. There is a story, it's a fable. You'll quickly realize that this wasn't true, but there's a story about the stonecutter. The stonecutter was a very humble, very meek man. He lived in a village. There wasn't a whole lot of construction going on in the village, so he didn't make a lot of work. But when there was work, he was an excellent stonecutter. He lived in a village shack with tattered clothes. So one day, the king of the land passed through his village. And as you can imagine, the entire village was abuzz because the king was passing through. Everybody was excited about this. The stonecutter got sick and tired of being a poor, miserable stonecutter, and he decided that he wanted to be a king. So that night when he went to sleep, he prayed, God, make me a king. And the next morning, the Lord made him a king. He ruled over his land. He was a good king. He was a gracious king. He ruled well over his land. But that summer, there was a drought, and many of the crops died. The animals started to die. People started to die. And the king decided, the sun is so powerful that it is literally killing the people of my land. The sun is much more powerful than I am. So that night, the king asked the Lord to make him into the sun. And the next morning, the king became a sun. The sun shined down on the land, and eventually the rain started to come, and the rains caused the crops to start to grow, and people were prosperous, and they ate, and they were fed, and they were satisfied. But the clouds started to block the sun's rays from the people. And the sun decided that the cloud was more powerful than he was. And so that night, the sun asked the Lord to make me into a cloud. And the next morning, the Lord made the sun into a cloud. The cloud rained down on the land, and the land started to grow crops, and the land was fertile, and it was great for farming. And the rain started to create rivers, and rivers started to cut paths to the land. And the only thing that the river could not break is the rocks, because when the river hit the rocks, it rolled across the edges. It would cut huge paths through the land, but the rocks were more powerful than the river. And so the cloud said to God, make me a rock. And the next morning, God made him a rock. And not long after that, a simple, humble man showed up with a hammer and a chisel, a stonecutter, and he started to chisel away on the rock. And the rock said that night to the Lord, one more time, God, would you make me into a stonecutter? And if you make me into a stonecutter, I will be the best, the happiest, the most content stonecutter in the land. And the stonecutter that became a king, that became a sun, which became a cloud, which became a stone, was turned one more time back into a stonecutter, and that man lived content and peaceful for the rest of his life. Our feeble, miserable attempt at grasping power. Every time we try to control the circumstances of our life, we're essentially pushing God to the margins and saying, God, I want to call the shots. I don't want you to call the shots. I want to call the shots in my life. And no matter how much power you get, you will never be able to completely control your circumstances, so you're always going to want more, and it will always leave you empty at the soul level. It can never fill you up at the soul level. No one ever becomes that powerful. So I'm asking you tonight to be on guard. I'm asking you tonight to gladly, willingly submit the little control that you do have in your life over to Jesus. And say, Jesus, you're much better qualified to control my life than I am. And I'm happy to turn the very limited power that I have over to you and to trust you with it. I want to ask you to bow your heads. I want to pray for us. The band's going to come back on stage in just a second, but I'm going to pray that all of us seriously examine your heart and ask the question, have I been trying to control my circumstances and pushing God to the margins in the process? Let me pray for you right now. Father in heaven, I lift up to you your people in this room, those who know you by name because of a relationship with Jesus. Would you cause all of us to be honest with you for just a second? Would you cause all of us to be willing to say, you know what, there have been times in my life, maybe it's some of us in this room right now, who have said, God, I have been trying to call the shots in my life and not let you call the shots in my life. I've been trying to be powerful enough to orchestrate my circumstances so that I didn't need you. And God, I've sinned. Will you forgive me? And Father, more importantly, would you cause your people right now to say, I'm content, I'm happy letting Jesus control the circumstances of my life, because I'm not a very good God. I don't even do a good job controlling my own circumstances. So from this point forward, I turn that control over to Jesus. If someone is in this room, Lord, who doesn't know you personally, this is going to sound completely foreign to them. Why should I give up control of my life? And it's because they've never experienced a life-transforming relationship with you. And I'm praying that maybe somebody in this room, maybe this is the first time in their life, right where they're sitting, they're deciding, I can't control my circumstances anymore. I've made a big mess of my life. I have sinned. I've blown it with God. And I'm sick and tired of living like this. So God, from this point forward, I'm putting it all in your hands. I am trusting you as my Lord and as my King, which means you control my circumstances. I don't. I believe that you sent your son Jesus from heaven. He gave up all of his power and authority in heaven to become a humble man on earth. I believe that Jesus submitted himself to the cross. He died the death on the cross that I deserve. And then he really put his power on display 3 days later when he rose from the grave and proved to the world who he really was. And so from this point forward, Jesus, you call the shots in my life. I don't. From this point forward, you are my Lord, and I will trust you and follow you wherever you lead me. Father, would you move among the hearts and souls of your people? Holy Spirit, would you prompt us to respond in whatever way honors Jesus' name? And I pray this for his glory and for his sake. Amen.